Space was quiet. It was always quiet out here. The ESV Unyielding moved slowly through the dark, far beyond the busy trade lanes and the bright systems where most ships like to stay. This part of space was called the Outer Veil. It had no proper name on most galactic maps. It was just empty space. The kind of place that nobody visited and nobody missed. The stars here were old and dim, and the silence felt heavy, like a blanket laid over something dying. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okafor was sitting at her signal station when she heard it. She almost missed it. The signal was buried under layers of cosmic noise, old radiation, dead frequencies, the hiss and pop of ancient starlight. It was weak, like a candle flame seen from across a very large room. But Sarah had good ears, and more importantly, she had the kind of patience that most people gave up on long before it paid off. She adjusted the receiver. The noise cleared a little, and the signal became something more than noise. It was a voice. She put on her headset and leaned forward. The voice was strange. The sounds were not human. They clicked and hummed and rose and fell in patterns she had never heard before. But the universal translator built into the station system chewed on it quietly, and after a few seconds, words began to appear on her screen, slow at first, then faster. "This is Val Prime. We are still here. We are asking for help. Our sun is failing. Our people are dying. Please, anyone, please respond." Sarah sat very still. She ran the signal back to its source. The computer traced the origin point, found the coordinates, then flagged something in red at the top of the screen. She read it twice. The signal was 112 years old. Not 112 days. Not 112 weeks. 112 years. This voice, this clicking, humming, desperate voice, had been calling out into the dark for over a century. Before Sarah's grandmother was born. Before humanity had even built its first deep-range survey ships. This signal had been flying through empty space for longer than most living humans had been alive. She pulled up the archive. The signal wasn't just one message. It was thousands of them, stacked on top of each other, recorded over decades. The station was programmed to keep broadcasting as long as it had power, and somehow, against everything, it still did. Sarah began playing them in order, starting from the oldest. The first ones were calm, professional, scientists and officials speaking in careful, measured tones. They described a star, their star, that was dying too fast. Not naturally fast, artificially fast. Some ancient weapon, left behind by a war nobody living remembered, had been triggered deep inside their sun. The star's internal fusion process was breaking down. They had calculated that without outside help, Vel Prime would become uninhabitable within 2 centuries. They asked the galactic confluence for assistance. They provided all their data, all their research. They were polite, they were reasonable. They got no answer. The messages from 20 years later were less calm. There was urgency in them now. The star had deteriorated faster than expected. The temperatures on the outer planets had already begun to drop. Agricultural zones were failing. There were food shortages. They broadcast again to the confluence. They attached updated data, and they listed the number of people who had already died. They asked again, clearly, humbly, for help. Still no answer. 30 years after that, the voices in the recordings changed. They were no longer officials. They were ordinary people. Parents, teachers, doctors. Their voices cracked when they spoke. They described what was happening on the ground. Cities going dark to save power. Children born into cold that never lifted. Old people choosing not to eat so their grandchildren could. Yet one woman recorded a message that was nothing but the sound of her daughter singing a lullaby. And then she said very quietly, "I am sending this so someone will know we existed, so someone will know we were real." Sarah had to stop the playback. She sat in the dim light of her station and stared at the wall. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound. Outside the viewport, the stars burned cold and far away. She thought about what kind of galaxy could hear a signal like this for 112 years and say nothing. She already knew the answer, and it made her feel something she couldn't quite name. It was not quite anger. It was not quite sadness. It was something in between. The feeling of discovering that the world is worse than you hoped. but also that you are still standing in it, and you still have hands, and therefore you are not done yet. She opened a channel to the bridge. "She's Captain Drev," she said. "You need to come hear this." Captain Eli Drev was a tall man with a quiet face and the kind of eyes that took a long time to look away from things. He stood beside Sarah's station for a long time, listening. He didn't speak while the recordings played. He didn't move. He just listened. When the most recent recording ended, a young Valthari scientist, voice thin and exhausted, it explaining that the star now had perhaps 30 years left before total collapse. Drev finally spoke. "How many of them are still alive?" he asked. Sarah checked the most recent data embedded in the signal. The last population count they broadcast was 14 years ago, about 4 million. Drev was quiet again. The rest of the bridge crew had gathered. Nobody had been told to come. They had simply heard something in Sarah's voice when she called, and they had come anyway. Now they stood in a loose half circle, and the silence among them was not empty. It was full of something. Ensign Priya Vasantha was the youngest crew member on the ship. She was 23 and had been in deep space for less than a year. She had grown up in a small city on Earth's eastern coast, and her mother had a garden, and she had never in her life seen anything die the way these recordings describe dying. She was crying now, quietly without hiding it. Nobody told her to stop. Navigator O.C. Maramba pulled up the star charts and found Vial Prime's location. It was deep in the outer veil, past 3 dead relay stations and 1 decommissioned trade post. Not close, but not unreachable either. "We could get there in 11 days at full burn," he said. "What can we do when we get there?" asked Chief Engineer Harada Yuki, not dismissively. "Just honestly. We're a survey ship. We're not a rescue fleet." "We could see," Sarah said. "We could see what's actually there. Yara, we could see them." There was weight in those words, "we could see them," as in, we could be the first people in 112 years to look at them and say, "We see you. You are not invisible. You are not nothing." Drev turned to Sarah. "What do you want to do?" Sarah had already written the message. She had typed it while the last recording was playing, knowing even then what her answer was going to be. She pulled it up and read it back to herself one more time. It was 6 words. "We found them. What do we do?" She looked at the captain. He gave her a small nod. She sent it. The unyielding didn't wait for a reply before changing course. That was Drev's decision, and he made it without ceremony. He simply told Miramba to set the new heading, told Harada to give him full engine output, and told the rest of the crew to get some sleep because they had 11 days and he wanted everyone sharp when they arrived. What he did not say, what none of them said out loud, was that they were all afraid, not of the Valthari, not of the dying star. They were afraid of what they would find when they got there. They were afraid that 4 million people would look at them with the eyes of something that had stopped believing anyone was coming. Sarah stayed at her station after the others left. She played the recordings again, more slowly this time. She listened to 112 years of a civilization trying to survive the silence of a galaxy that had decided they weren't worth saving. She listened to the scientists in the early years, precise and hopeful. She listened to the politicians in the middle years, still formal but beginning to crack. She listened to the ordinary people in the later years, who no longer asked the galaxy for anything except to be remembered. And she listened to the very last message, recorded 3 months ago, which meant the station still had power, which meant someone was still down there tending to it. And this last voice was young, maybe a teenager, and it said something that Sarah would carry with her for the rest of her life. "We have not given up. I don't know why. Maybe it is stupid not to give up, but we haven't. Someone told me once that hope is not about believing things will get better. Hope is just refusing to stop. And so we are refusing. We are still here. We are still sending this. If you can hear us, please, please come." Sarah pressed her palm flat against the desk. The metal was cold under her hand. Outside, the stars of the outer veil drifted past the viewport. Old stars. Tired stars. The kind of stars that had seen too many things go dark. The unyielding burned through the dark at full speed, heading toward a dying sun and 4 million people who had never stopped calling. Heinen's somewhere behind them, racing back across the light years toward Earth. 6 words were traveling at the speed of light. We found them. What do we do? The galaxy did not answer, but humanity would. The message arrived at Earth Command at 4:47 in the morning, Geneva time. By 5:15, it had been forwarded to 12 different department heads. By 6 o'clock, it had reached the desk of Secretary General Amara Diallo, who read it over her morning coffee, set the cup down carefully, and said nothing for almost 3 full minutes. By 8 o'clock, the recordings from the Valthari signal had been attached to a secure briefing package and sent to every sitting member of the United Earth Assembly. By noon, somebody had leaked the recordings to the press. By midnight, the entire planet had heard them. It started with a girl on Mars. Her name was Dani Vasquez. She was 17 years old, lived in the Olympus settlement. Ian had a small personal broadcast channel that mostly posted about hydroponic gardening and old Earth films. She had maybe 4,000 followers. When the leaked recordings hit the public feeds, she did something very simple. She opened her broadcast, sat down at her desk, and began reading the transcripts of the Valthari distress calls out loud. She didn't add commentary. She didn't editorialize. She just read. She read the first scientist's careful report from 112 years ago. She read the mid-century pleas from ordinary Valthari families. She read the message from the mother who sent her daughter singing. She read all of it in the flat, plain voice of someone who wants the words themselves to be heard without decoration. She was 4 hours into the broadcast when her follower count passed 1 million. She didn't stop. She read until her voice was gone, until she was barely whispering, and then she held up a handwritten sign that said, "They are still there." Well, what are we going to do? The broadcast was reshared so many times that the servers flagged it as anomalous traffic. By morning, it had been watched by over 2 billion people. Nobody organized what happened next. That was the thing people would talk about later when historians tried to explain it. There was no committee. There was no campaign. There was no single leader who stood up and said, "Follow me." What happened was something much stranger and much more human than that. The people just started doing things. A dock worker on Titan Station, a man named Brecht Hauer, who repaired cargo loader arms for a living and had no particular fame or money, transferred every credit in his savings account to a public relief fund that had been set up that morning by a group of volunteers who weren't even sure it was legal yet. He posted one message to explain, "I heard the recordings. I can't not do something. This is all I have." Within 6 hours, the fund had received contributions from 11 million people. In a university on Earth's moon, a team of engineering students had been up all night. They hadn't slept. They had pulled every research paper on stellar dynamics they could find and were working on something that their professors said was impossible, a theoretical method for slowing down the Valthari sun's decay. They had no resources, no funding, and no official permission to work on this problem. They worked on it anyway. When their department head came in the next morning and found them all asleep at their desks with equations covering every surface, he looked at what they had written for a long time. Then he quietly left and came back with more coffee and did not tell them to stop. On Earth, in a small fishing town on the coast of what used to be called Norway, an old woman named Ingrid watched the recordings on her kitchen screen with her hands folded in her lap. When they finished, she turned to her husband and said, "Well, we have to help them." Her husband nodded and said, "Yes, of course we do." This conversation, in various forms, was happening in kitchens and living rooms and dormitories and break rooms all over Earth and its colonies. Not everyone agreed. But the people who did agree were not quiet about it. Cargo pilots began filing independent flight plans toward the outer veil. Not military pilots. Ordinary freight haulers who moved industrial goods between stations for a living. They weren't asked to go. Nobody told them to. They filed their plans and loaded whatever supplies they could legally carry and waited to see what would happen. The United Earth Assembly convened an emergency session 3 days after the recordings went public. The chamber in Geneva was full, every seat taken, every observer gallery packed, and outside the building, in the broad plaza, a crowd had gathered that stretched out of sight. They were quiet, mostly. They held simple signs. Some just stood there, watching the big public screens that broadcast the proceedings live. Secretary General Diallo opened the session with a summary of the situation. She was direct and did not soften the facts. The Valthari were a species of approximately 4 million. Their sun was in terminal decline. The galactic confluence had refused assistance 11 times over the course of a century. Armin in the ESV Unyielding, a human survey ship, had found the signal and was currently 6 days out from Vale Prime. Then the floor opened. The debate was fierce. There were members who stood up and said clearly and honestly that humanity could not afford this. Earth's own outer colonies still needed resources. The technical challenge of stabilizing a dying star was beyond any known engineering. Sending ships into the outer veil would stretch human logistics to the breaking point. These were not heartless people making these arguments. They were practical people, and their points were real. But then Ambassador Kenji Morrow of the Galactic Confluence delegation was given the floor. Morrow was not human. He was a confluence diplomatic liaison, a species called the Dovan, blue-skinned and long-fingered, known for their careful and precise thinking. He stood at the podium and delivered, in a very measured voice, the confluence's official position. Into the Valthari situation was regrettable but resolved. The resources required for a rescue operation were not justifiable. Humanity, as a young and developing civilization, would benefit from following the guidance of older, more experienced member species. It was not wise to act on emotion. The confluence strongly advised restraint. He sat down. The assembly chamber was silent for a moment. Then a representative from the Pacific Collective, a young woman named Hana Seo, stood up. She did not speak loudly. She did not shout. She simply said, "Ambassador Morrow, with respect, we have listened to those recordings. We have heard of people calling for help for 112 years, and I need to ask you directly, at what point in your confluence's long and experienced history was the right moment to answer them? Because that moment came and went 112 years ago, and it kept coming and going, and you kept choosing not to act. Homer, you are asking us to follow your example. I don't think we want to." The crowd outside watching the live feed erupted. Inside the chamber, the noise took a long time to settle. The vote came the following afternoon. Sarah's message, "We found them. What do we do?" had been translated into dozens of languages and was printed on signs outside. People chanted it, quietly but together. When the assembly voted, it was not close. When the resolution passed by a margin that surprised even its most optimistic supporters. But what was more surprising than the margin was what the resolution actually said. It was not a military declaration. It was not an aid package with conditions. It was not a loan or a temporary relief mission with an exit clause. It was something the galaxy had no proper legal category for, because the galaxy had never seen anything quite like it before. The resolution read, in full, "The people of Earth and all human settlements, by this declaration, take the Valthari people under our protection, our care, and our full commitment. We will not weigh the cost against the value of their lives. We will not set a deadline for our help or attach conditions to our presence. We will go to them, we will stay with them, and we will not leave until they are safe. This is not a political act. It is a human one." It passed with 289 votes in favor, 212 abstentions. Not a single vote against. Ambassador Morrow had left the chamber before the vote was called. He sent a formal transmission to the confluence that night, marked urgent, which read, "Humanity has voted to intervene at Vel Prime. They are proceeding. I have no further ability to dissuade them." The confluence's reply arrived 12 hours later. It was long and formal and full of careful diplomatic language. It essentially said that humanity was making a mistake, that this was reckless, that the resources would be wasted, that the confluence took no responsibility for any consequences. Secretary General Diallo read the response and handed it to her aide. "File it," she said. "Under what category?" the aide asked. Diallo thought for a moment. "Noted and disregarded," she said. "File it under that." The convoy began forming within 48 hours of the vote. Ships came from everywhere. Military escort vessels, scientific research ships, colony supply freighters, private cargo haulers, mobile medical platforms, engineering barges loaded with raw materials and fabrication equipment. The fleet that gathered at the outer transit point was unlike anything assembled in human history. Not organized for war, not moving for profit, just moving. Going somewhere because they were needed there. The last ship to join the convoy was a small personal transport registered to one Brecht Hauer of Titan Station. He had quit his job, Emer spent every credit he had, and filed his own flight plan. When the convoy coordinator tried to redirect him back to civilian lanes, he sent a single response. "I'm going. You can assign me a position in the formation or I'll follow behind. Either way, I'm going." They gave him a position in the formation. Sarah Okafor, still aboard the Unyielding, and now 3 days from Vial Prime, received a transmission update listing the ships that were coming. She scrolled through the list for a long time. Hundreds of names, thousands of people. She thought about the Confluence ambassador saying it was reckless. She thought about the 12 abstentions in the assembly vote and the honest fears behind them. And she thought about Danny Vasquez on Mars reading for hours until her voice was gone, holding up a handwritten sign. They are still there. What are we going to do? Sarah looked out at the dark and smiled. Now they knew. And Vial Prime was beautiful. That was the first thing Sarah noticed when the Unyielding dropped out of its transit burn and the planet came into view on the forward screen. She had expected something bleak, a dying world, gray and cold and broken. But from space, Val Prime still looked alive. Its surface shimmered with deep blues and greens, the colors of forests and oceans that had not yet surrendered, even though the temperature readings on her screen told a darker story. The star it orbited was a dim, sickly orange, not the bright warm yellow it should have been. The planet's shadow side was very dark. The light side was not bright enough. It looked, Sarah thought, like a beautiful face that was slowly going pale. She opened the hailing frequency and broadcast on every channel the Valthari had used in their recordings. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okafor of the ESV Unyielding, Earth Survey Division. We received your signal. We are here. Please respond." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. She counted them. Then the channel crackled and a voice came through, high and clicking and unmistakably Valthari. And the translator worked fast, and the words that came out were, "We hear you. We hear you. Are you real? Please tell us you are real." Sarah pressed her hand flat on the console, the same way she had done back at her station when she first heard the recordings. The metal was cold. She pressed harder. "Yeah, we are real," she said. "We are very real. And there are more of us coming." The Unyielding was given permission to enter orbit, then to land. The landing site was outside the largest remaining city, which the Valthari called Thessavar. It had once held 2 million people. It now held about 800,000. The rest had moved south, toward the equatorial belt where the temperature was still survivable. When the buildings were tall and made of a pale stone that glowed faintly with bioluminescent moss, and the streets were clean and orderly in a way that said something important. These people had not given up. They had kept their city. They had kept their order. They had kept going, even when going meant walking through cold that bit deeper every year. The welcoming party that met the Unyielding at the landing pad was small. A dozen Valthari standing very still, watching the ship settle onto the ground with expressions that the translator program could not fully process. Their bodies were insectoid, tall with 6 limbs, 2 of which they used as arms and 4 as legs. Their exoskeletons ranged from pale silver to deep teal, and embedded within them were patches of soft tissue that glowed, bioluminescent organs that shifted color with emotion. Right now, those patches were a dim, cautious amber, uncertain, guarded, waiting. Sarah walked down the landing ramp first, alone, without weapons, without armor. She had made that decision deliberately. She wore her standard uniform and nothing else. And when she reached the bottom of the ramp and stood on the soil of Vale Prime for the first time, she simply stopped and waited. The Valthari didn't move for a long moment. Then the one at the front, a tall female with silver-gray exoskeleton and serious, deep-set eyes, stepped forward. Her bioluminescent patches shifted from amber to something cooler, something more careful. "You are human," she said through the translator. It was not a question. "Yes," Sarah said. "You are the ones who voted." "Yes." Another pause. The Valthari's glow shifted again. Something warmer now, just slightly. My name is Iravel, she said. I am the head of what remains of our stellar physics division. Nan, I have been waiting. We have all been waiting for someone to come for a very long time. She stopped. Her voice, even through the translator, had something fragile in it. I did not believe you would actually come. We almost didn't know you were there, Sarah said honestly. We're sorry it took so long. Iravel looked at her for a long time. You are sorry, she said slowly, as if tasting the word. That is a strange thing to say. You did not leave us. Others did. Yes, Iravel said. Her glow dimmed slightly. Others did. The convoy arrived over the next 9 days, ship by ship, until Vial Prime's orbit was crowded with human vessels that blinked and moved like a small artificial constellation. The Vilthari watched them come from the ground with expressions their bodies didn't quite have a color for. The work began immediately, because there was no time to waste. The human engineers spread across the planet and into orbit like water-filling spaces. They were not tidy about it. They argued loudly among themselves in corridors and across open channels. They jury-rigged equipment in ways that made Valthari engineers physically uncomfortable. And they had the maddening habit of saying close enough about calculations that were absolutely not close enough. But they also worked without stopping. They shared every piece of data they had freely and without condition, and they had brought with them an enormous amount of very good food, which turned out to matter more than anyone expected. The Valthari had been in controlled calorie rationing for 40 years. The first time a human cook, a large cheerful man named Marco from the supply ship Generosa, set up a portable kitchen in the Thesavar Central Square and started handing out hot food, a crowd gathered that nobody had anticipated. Marco cooked for 6 straight hours, sorry, running out of ingredients twice and being resupplied twice by people running back to the ship at a sprint, and he fed over 2,000 Valthari that day. And he cried while he cooked because he couldn't stop thinking about the recordings, and he had been a cook his whole life, and feeding people was the only language he really knew. It was not the most important thing the humans did on Vial Prime, but it was, in some ways, the first thing that made the Vilthari believe the humans were real. The most important thing happened in a basement. Iravel had spent 31 years working on the stellar collapse problem. She had begun as a young scientist, full of hope and theoretical tools, and she had ground herself down to nothing against it year after year, producing calculation after calculation that almost worked, that came close but never close enough. She had 3 graduate students left. She had salvaged equipment that required constant maintenance and sometimes just stopped working mid-calculation. When she met Dr. Thomas Reinhold, she did not immediately like him. Reinhold was a human quantum field theorist, a short, wiry man with untidy hair and the slightly unfocused eyes of someone who was always looking at something that wasn't in the room. He talked fast, jumped between subjects without warning, and had an extremely irritating habit of saying, "Oh, interesting," when he meant something much more significant than that. He came to Iravel's basement lab on the 2nd day, uninvited, sat down at her spare workstation without asking, and started reading through 30 years of her research. He read for 4 hours without speaking. Iravel kept working, watching him from the corner of her eye, waiting for him to say something dismissive, waiting for him to explain what she had done wrong, waiting for the familiar experience of someone from outside looking at her life's work and explaining why it had failed. Instead, Reinhold looked up from the screen, and his eyes had the look of someone who had just seen something that genuinely surprised him. He said very quietly, "Oh, interesting." "What?" Iravel said, sharper than she meant to. "This section here, your resonance cascade modeling from 12 years ago. You were right. You were almost exactly right. But you were working with the wrong constant for this type of stellar core. We recalculated it 6 years ago in a completely different context, for a mining operation near a neutron star, of all things. And the corrected value is this." He wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk to her. Iravel looked at the number. She sat very still. She picked up the paper and went to her main workstation and began running calculations. Reinhold watched her. He didn't speak. He understood instinctively that this was not a moment for speaking. 40 minutes later, Iravel set down her stylus. If this constant is correct, she said, and her voice was very carefully controlled, then the resonance cascade approach is viable. The stellar relay ignition is theoretically achievable. Yes, Reinhold said, with the right equipment. We have it, or we can build it. Most of it is already in the convoy. Iravel turned to look at him. Her bioluminescent patches, in which had been dim and cautious since the day the humans arrived, shifted suddenly. They went from amber to something Reinhold had never seen before. A deep, shimmering gold that pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. He would later learn that this color meant something close to what humans might call overwhelming relief. I have been working on this problem for 31 years, she said. I know, Reinhold said, and you solved it. If we just had a number you were missing. Not everyone trusted the humans. This was fair. This was reasonable. The Valthari had been promised help before. Twice in the early years of their crisis, alien species had come with offers of assistance and then quietly withdrawn when the political cost became inconvenient. There were Valthari who looked at the humans now with polite faces and cold eyes, waiting for the same thing to happen again, waiting for the humans to leave. The one who trusted least was Thesivakal Morn. He was the oldest living Valthari on the planet, over 200 years old, which was ancient even by their standards. He had been a young man when the first distress calls were sent. He had lived through every decade of silence that followed. He had buried people he loved. He had watched the sky grow dimmer every year. He had a quiet, the hollow look in his eyes that Sarah recognized from very old human war photographs. The look of someone who has survived things they were not supposed to survive and is not entirely sure what the surviving was for. He refused to meet with any human representative. He sent a message through Iravel that said, I am glad they are here. I am glad they are working. I wish them success. I will not meet with them. When Iravel asked why, he said simply, because if I hope and it goes wrong again, and I will not survive it. I am too old and too tired to survive it again. Sarah did not push. She sent back one message through Iravel, addressed to Thesivak. I understand. Take all the time you need. We will still be here. The work continued. The arrays were designed. The materials were fabricated. The math was checked, and then checked again, and then checked a third time by a team of 12 physicists who argued constantly and brilliantly. The Valthari and humans worked side by side in the labs, in the fabrication bays in orbit. Slowly, carefully, the strangeness between them wore down, the way stone wears down next to running water. Not dramatically, not all at once, just bit by bit, until one day Iravel realized she had laughed at something Reinhold said. Genuinely laughed, and felt strange about it for a moment, and then let the feeling be. One evening, Sarah was sitting outside the lab, while looking up at the dim orange star through the thin clouds. She heard a sound behind her and turned. Thesivak ul Morn was standing there. He was very tall, his exoskeleton pale and faintly worn at the edges with age. His bioluminescent patches were dark, deliberately dimmed, she would later learn, a Valthari gesture of approaching carefully. He sat down beside her, not close, just near. They sat in silence for a long time. And then he said, Why would your people bleed for strangers? Sarah thought about it for a long time. She thought about Danny Vasquez reading until her voice gave out. She thought about Brecht Hauer giving away everything he had. She thought about Marco crying over a portable stove in a cold square. Because someone once bled for us, she finally said, when we were strangers to ourselves. Thesivak was quiet for a moment. And then he said, That is a strange answer. It's the only one I have. He sat with her a little while longer. Then he stood and walked back inside. But before he did, his bioluminescent patches shifted, just for a moment, just briefly, from dark to the faintest, most careful edge of gold. Sarah watched him go and said nothing. She looked back up at the dying star. It was not dead yet, and the humans were not done yet either. The Krethal fleet arrived on a Tuesday, and there was no particular reason it should have been a Tuesday. The Krethal did not follow the human calendar. But it was a Tuesday on the Unyielding's internal clock, and Sarah was drinking coffee when the alert went off, which is how she would always remember it. Tuesday coffee, and the sudden cold feeling of something going very wrong. 14 warships. They came out of transit burn in a clean, tight formation. The kind of formation that was not accidental. The kind that said someone had practiced this approach many times in preparation for exactly this moment. They positioned themselves at the edge of the Veil Prime system, just inside the legal boundary of open space, and they stopped. They did not hail anyone. They simply sat there, engines hot, weapons cold but ready, watching. Commander of the human convoy's escort wing, Vice Admiral Nadia Osei, had been awake when the alert went off. She was a calm woman from Earth's east coast who had spent 30 years in deep space and had developed the ability to be entirely unrattled on the outside while doing very fast thinking on the inside. She looked at the Krethal formation on her tactical screen for about 4 seconds. Then she opened a channel to every human ship in the system. All ships, this is Osei. We have guests. Nobody moves without my order. Nobody fires. Nobody does anything aggressive or dramatic. One, we stay calm and we stay in position. She paused, then added, but we stay in position. The Krethal Dominion was not officially at war with anyone. They were also not officially friendly with anyone. They existed in the space between those two things. A large militaristic empire that had spent centuries acquiring territory through quiet pressure and the implied threat of what happened to people who said no. They did not often need to fight. They just needed to be the largest, the most dangerous thing in the area, and let the natural conclusion follow. They had been watching Veil Prime for decades. The Valthari's dying star sat in the middle of a region rich in rare minerals and a very useful transit corridor. When the star collapsed and the Valthari were gone, the Krethal had planned to claim the whole system as an unoccupied resource zone. It was clean. It was legal, technically. It just required the Valthari to finish dying, which they had been helpfully doing on their own. And then the humans came, with their hundreds of ships and their impossible engineering project, and their irritating refusal to understand that the Valthari were already dead. The Krethal's official message, when it finally came, was delivered in the careful language of diplomacy, or it spoke of sovereignty concerns in the Outer Veil region. It expressed uncertainty about the legal status of unsanctioned operations in unclaimed space. It suggested that the human presence was potentially destabilizing and recommended that all non-Valthari vessels withdraw for the sake of regional stability. Every word was chosen to mean something it wasn't saying. What it was actually saying was, leave, or we will make you leave. Vice Admiral Osei read the message carefully. And then she wrote her response, read it back to herself once, and sent it. Her response was not in the careful language of diplomacy. It was in the clear language of someone who has decided not to pretend. It said, the Valthari people are under human protection by formal declaration of the United Earth Assembly. We are here at their invitation and with their full cooperation. We will complete our work and we will not withdraw. We encourage the Krethal Dominion to maintain the current distance and await the conclusion of our mission. We have no desire for conflict. We do, however, have a desire to finish what we started. This system belongs to the Valthari. We are simply helping them keep it. She sent it to the Krethal fleet, and she copied the entire galactic confluence. The galactic confluence received the message and erupted. The High Chamber, a vast, multi-tiered hall on the confluence's central station, built to hold representatives from over 300 species, had been called into emergency session within hours of the Krethal fleet's arrival. The chamber was loud in the way that only a room full of very different beings, all having very different opinions at the same time, can be loud. Translators worked overtime. Diplomatic aides ran between desks. Arguments were had in 6 dozen languages simultaneously. There were species in that chamber who were furious at the humans. They said exactly what Ambassador Morrow had said earlier, that humanity was young, reckless, and acting on emotion rather than reason, that this would cause a conflict, that no one species had the right to unilaterally declare protection over another without confluence approval, that the humans were going to get people killed. There were also species who said nothing, because they sat quietly in their seats and watched and calculated and waited. And then there was the Suvari Collective. The Suvari were ancient, much older than the confluence itself. They had been members almost since the confluence's founding. They were small, quiet beings. Their appearance unremarkable, their manner always reserved. They had not said anything in the open chamber in 11 years. When their representative stood up, the room went quiet. Ambassador Yevesian was old, even by Suvari standards. She walked slowly to the speaking platform and stood there for a moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice was soft, and the chamber was silent enough that every translator could hear her perfectly. I want to tell the chamber something, she said. Something historical. The Suvari were abandoned once. Not as long ago as the Valthari have been waiting, but long enough. We sent signals. We asked for help. We were told by this very body, that the cost was too high, that we were not strategically viable. We almost did not survive. She paused. I am not speaking tonight to assign blame. I am speaking because I want this chamber to understand something that apparently requires saying out loud. There are species alive in this galaxy today only because someone decided, against all reasonable calculation, to help them anyway. The Suvari are one of them. She looked around the room slowly. We have been watching what the humans are doing at Vale Prime, and I want to say, for the record, that we remember what it felt like to be the Valthari, and we know what it would have meant to us if someone had come. She stepped back from the platform. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then, from 3 separate sections of the chamber, representatives of 3 minor species stood up simultaneously and moved to the communication terminals at their seats. Within the hour, and each of them had transmitted orders to their small defense fleets. Those fleets quietly repositioned themselves alongside the human convoy at Val Prime. Not to fight, just to be there, just to stand. Back in the Val Prime system, the Krethal fleet had not moved. Neither had the humans. Days passed. The work on the stellar relay arrays continued. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, in zero gravity, in the cold of space, welding and calibrating and checking and rechecking. The arrays were enormous, each one the size of a small city, built from materials brought by the convoy and fabricated on site, anchored in precise positions around the dying star. The Krethal watched. They sent no more messages. They did not fire. They did not retreat. Sarah watched them back from the Unyielding's bridge. She didn't sleep well during those days. She lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling, and thought about what 14 warships could do to a convoy of civilian freighters and science vessels, and one man in a personal transport who had spent all his money to be there. She thought about it, and she thought about the alternative, and she kept coming to the same conclusion. There was no version of this where going home was the right answer. She went back to the bridge. She drank more coffee. She watched the arrays take shape against the dark. On the 8th day of the standoff, a small Krethal courier ship broke from the formation and traveled to the Unyielding. It requested a private meeting. Sarah met the Krethal envoy alone in a conference room. The envoy was not military. He was a trade official, a thin being in civilian clothes who looked like he had not slept in several days. He sat down and folded his hands on the table and looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who has been sent to do a job they do not personally enjoy. Fleet Command would like to understand something, he said carefully. What would they like to understand? Sarah asked. Whether you are bluffing. Sarah considered this. About what, specifically? About staying, about not leaving, about defending people you have no political obligation to defend. Sarah leaned forward a little. Aunt, we are not bluffing, she said simply. We are not going to leave. We are going to finish what we came to do. If the fleet engages us, they will be attacking medical ships and cargo freighters and a lot of engineers who are very tired and very committed. I don't know what your fleet command will decide to do with that information, but that is the information. The envoy looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, stood, and left. The Krethal fleet did not move for 2 more days. Then, quietly without announcement, it turned and burned back the way it had come. 14 ships gone. No message. No explanation. Just the empty space where they had been. On the bridge of the Unyielding, Sarah let out a breath she had been holding for 9 days. Navigator Maramba turned from his station and looked at her. You knew they'd leave, he said. I hoped, Sarah said honestly. There's a difference? She thought about Thesavac sitting beside her in the dark, about Iravel's gold glow, About Danny Vasquez whispering with a voice that had given out. Not really, she said. Not for us. In the Galactic Confluence High Chamber, Ambassador Yevasian was sitting in her seat when her aide whispered to her that the Krithal had withdrawn. She sat quietly for a moment. Beside her, another old diplomat, a being called Vorathis of the Dovan species, so who had been in the confluence for 8 centuries, leaned over and said very quietly, I have been doing this for 800 years. I know, Yevashian said. I have never seen anything like this. No, she agreed. What is it about them? Vorathis asked. Not dismissively, genuinely. Why do they do this? Yevashian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, to simply, they do not calculate whether love is affordable. Vorathis sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the great chamber for a long time. Outside, the stars burned on, and at Val Prime, the arrays were almost ready. The galaxy was watching, and the humans were almost done. The morning of the ignition, everything was very quiet. That surprised Sarah. She had expected noise, excitement, maybe fear, the hum of last-minute activity. Instead, when she walked out of the unyielding and onto the surface of Vial Prime in the gray, cold, early light, she found that people had simply stopped. All over the city of Thessavar, the work had paused. Engineers who had been running on stimulants and stubbornness for 3 weeks were standing outside with their faces turned up to the sky. Valthari, who had spent a lifetime learning not to look at the sun, because looking at it only reminded them of how sick it was, were looking at it now. The star was dim and orange and tired, but today, if everything worked, that would change. The arrays were in position. Iravel and Reinhold had confirmed it. The calculations had been checked so many times that half the physics team dreamed about numbers in their sleep. The equipment was calibrated. The relay trigger was ready. Everything that could be done had been done. Now the only thing left was to try. The command center was set up in a large room on the top floor of Thessavar's main science building. A room with wide windows that looked out on the city and above it, the sky. Banks of screens covered every wall, each one showing a different feed. The arrays in orbit, the stellar surface, the atmospheric readings, the relay power levels, the 100 different measurements that would tell them in real time whether the ignition was working or whether it was failing. Iravel stood at the primary console. She had been standing there since dawn, running checks that did not need to be run again, because it was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. Reinhold stood beside her. He was not running any checks. He had finished his last check 6 hours ago, and since then had been standing very still, which was unusual for him. He was normally always moving, always tapping or pacing or scribbling something. Today he was still, and Sarah understood that this was what Reinhold looked like when he had done everything he could do, and the rest was out of his hands. Around them, the room was full of people, human engineers, Valthari scientists, a small group of observers, including the 3 minor species representatives who had repositioned their ships alongside the convoy during the standoff. They stood quietly at the back of the room. They had not said much since arriving. They just wanted to be present. Sarah understood that too. She took her position at the side of the room, out of the way. This was not her moment to lead. It was Iravel's. Iravel straightened at the console. Her bioluminescent patches, which had been shifting restlessly all morning, settled into a calm, deep amber. She looked around the room once. Her gaze moved over the human faces and the Valthari faces without distinction, and she took a long, slow breath that the translator captured as a soft, sustained hum. And then she said, "Begin ignition sequence." The sequence took 4 minutes and 30 seconds from initiation to trigger point. On the screens, they watched the arrays activate, enormous structures glittering in the dark of space, coming alive with power drawn from every generator on every ship in the convoy. The energy levels climbed. The relay pathways synchronized one by one until all 47 arrays were linked in a single network. On the stellar surface feed, instruments began detecting slight changes in the outer photosphere as the resonance began to build. The room was completely silent. The only sounds were the soft processing hum of the consoles and, somewhere in the city below, a low note, a Valthari tone, wordless. Many voices together. It was not quite singing. It was something older than singing. It was the sound a people makes when they are waiting for something so important that language isn't enough. The counter on the main screen counted down. 30 seconds. Iravel's hand rested over the final trigger. She did not look at the screen. She looked at Reinhold. He looked at her. "It's correct," he said, not loudly, just to her. "The math is correct." She nodded once. 10 seconds. Sarah realized she was holding her breath. She looked around the room. Everyone was holding their breath. Even the beings at the back of the room, who had come from other worlds and other histories, were still and wide-eyed. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Iravel pressed the trigger. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. The screen showed the same readings. The star's surface remained unchanged. The resonance readings sat at their baseline. The relay network held its power levels steady, pushing energy into a cascade that showed no sign of starting. 11 seconds is not very long in most circumstances. In this room, in this moment, 11 seconds felt like being held underwater. Then, on the stellar surface feed, something moved. It started small, a ripple, like the way water moves when you drop a stone into a still pond, except this was a star, and the stone was 47 synchronized energy arrays built by two species who had combined 30 years of theoretical work to crack a problem that no civilization had ever solved before. The ripple spread. The temperature readings jumped, then jumped again. It then started climbing in a curve that made Iravel's breath catch audibly. The fusion reaction in the star's core, which had been slowing for over a century, strangled by whatever ancient weapon had poisoned it, began to accelerate. The color of the stellar surface shifted. The dull orange brightened. The photosphere churned. The screens lit up. And then, through the windows of the command center, the sky over the Savr changed. It was not dramatic. It was not an explosion or a blinding flash. It was slow, gradual. The dim orange light that had fallen on Vale Prime for longer than most of its inhabitants had been alive began, quietly and then less quietly, to warm, to brighten. The long shadows on the city below shrank and sharpened. The pale stone of the buildings caught the light differently, richer, deeper, the way stone looks when it's being properly lit for the first time in a very long time. Someone in the room made a sound. Just one person at first. A soft, broken sound, not quite a word. And then more people, and then the room was full of sound that had no category. Not cheering exactly, not crying exactly. Something in between. Something that lived in the space where relief and disbelief meet and hold each other up. Iravel did not make a sound. She stood at the console and looked at the readings for a long time, and her bioluminescent patches went through colors that Reinhold had never seen before. Cycling quickly through amber and gold, and something bright and pale and trembling that he would later ask a Valthari biologist to name. The biologist told him there was no single word for it. The closest translation was, the feeling of something coming back that you believed was gone forever. Reinhold put his hand on Iravel's shoulder. She covered his hand with hers. Neither of them said anything. Kiwan Desivakal Morn was standing in the garden behind the archive building when the sky changed. He had not gone to the command center. He was too old for rooms full of noise and hope. He had come here instead, to the garden he had tended for 40 years, where the plants grew slowly and carefully under artificial light because the natural light had stopped being enough. He had come here because if it failed, he wanted to be somewhere quiet. And if it worked, he had not let himself finish that thought. He stood among his plants and watched the light change. It came slowly. He might have missed it if he had looked away. But he had been standing there for an hour, watching the pale strip of sky above the garden walls. And so he saw it happen. The moment the light shifted from orange to something warmer, something that touched the back of his memory in a way that hurt because it was so far away, so old. A feeling from before the crisis, before the cold, before everything. He stood very still. The light grew. He had lived for over 200 years. He had buried friends and students and children he had watched grow up in a world that kept getting colder. He had kept sending the distress signals for decades after he stopped believing anyone would come, because stopping felt like the last betrayal, and he had refused to be the one to give that up. He had lived with a constant grief for so long that it had become the texture of being alive. So familiar he had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. The light touched his face. Real light. Warm light. The light his world had been missing for his entire adult life. Tessavacal Morn stood in his garden and felt it on his exoskeleton. The warmth of a star that was no longer dying. And he did not speak and he did not move. He simply opened his bioluminescent patches to their fullest, in the way Valthari do only in their most unguarded moments. The way they do when no performance is possible, because the feeling is too big for performance. They blazed gold, brighter than Sarah had ever seen them, brighter than she had known they could go. Every patch across his whole body, brilliant and pulsing, like a small sun had woken up inside him. He stood there for a long time. When Sarah found him, she stopped in the doorway of the garden and said nothing. She didn't want to interrupt. She almost left. But then Thesavac turned, and when he saw her, he did not close his patches or dim them. He let her see. They looked at each other across the small garden for a long moment. Then the old Valthari walked toward her, and he did something that surprised her completely. He reached out and placed one of his forearms, carefully, gently, over her shoulder. A Valthari gesture she didn't know. She stayed very still. Later, Iravel told her that in their culture, it was what you did when you wanted to say I was wrong to doubt you. It was also what you did for someone who had done something you could not find words for. Sarah put her hand over his arm and held it. In the months that followed, things changed. The galactic confluence, faced with images of a brightening star and 4 million Valthari alive and safe and beginning, carefully to rebuild, was forced to act. They formally recognized the Valthari as a protected sovereign species. When they issued a resolution acknowledging what the Human Declaration had called a human act, and providing the Valthari with Confluence membership, access to galactic aid programs, and the legal protections they had been denied for over a century. It was late. Everyone knew it was late. The Valthari said so directly in their acceptance speech, and the room was quiet while they said it. But it was done. The Suvari Collective formally applied to open diplomatic channels with Earth. Or the three species who had repositioned their ships became, over the following years, close partners of humanity. The Krethal Dominion lodged a formal protest over the Vale Prime outcome, and then said nothing further publicly, though intelligence reports suggested significant internal debate about what had happened and what it meant. Iravel and Reinhold published their Stellar Relay Ignition paper jointly, the first interspecies co-authored paper on record in the field of applied stellar physics. It was downloaded more times in its first week than any scientific paper in galactic history. Marco the cook opened a small restaurant in Thesavar. It was always full. Brecht Hauer went home to Titan Station eventually, broke and happy. So he found that he had been given a new job by the station authority while he was gone. They had seen the broadcasts and decided they wanted him to stay, and that his savings account had been quietly restocked by an anonymous transfer from 11 million different sources. Donnie Vasquez from Mars received a personal message from Iravel, who thanked her by name and said that the broadcast had been watched by Valthari in the shelters of Vial Prime's southern cities, who had heard the transcripts read aloud in a human voice and had believed, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone out there was actually listening. Danny sat in her small room in the Olympus settlement and read the message 3 times. Then she recorded a new broadcast, the first one in a year, and it was just her, sitting at her desk, and she said, "I'm not a politician or an engineer or a soldier. I just read some words out loud. But I guess that's the thing about humans. Sometimes reading words out loud is enough. Sometimes showing up is enough. Sometimes saying, 'I hear you,' changes everything." Sarah Okafor sat on the hull of the Unyielding on the last night before the ship broke orbit. Vial Prime was below her, a living world again. Not fully healed, not overnight, but breathing, growing, warming. The star burned orange-yellow in the dark, healthy and slow, the way stars were supposed to burn. The arrays had been dismantled. Most of the convoy was already gone. Tomorrow the Unyielding would go too. She opened her personal log. She sat for a moment, thinking about what she wanted to say. Then she spoke. They asked us why. Pretty much everyone asked us why. The confluence, the Krathal, the species who stood beside us, the ones who didn't understand. They all wanted a clean answer, something logical, something that made the math make sense. And we never really had one. I don't think we need one. They were left to die by the galaxy. And we decided, all of us, together, that the galaxy was wrong. That's a human thing. We see what's broken and we can't help thinking, it doesn't have to stay this way. We are loud and messy, and sometimes we scare even ourselves. But when we heard a signal that had been calling for 112 years with no answer, we didn't calculate. We answered. I think that's enough. I think that's who we are. She closed the log. Below her, the Vale Prime turned slowly in the light of its living star, and the city of Thesavar glowed, partly from lights in its buildings, partly from the soft, steady bioluminescence of 4 million people who were going to survive after all. Sarah looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside and the unyielding prepared to go home. Across the galaxy, in the archives and broadcasts and conversation rooms of 100 different species, the story spread. It was told and retold and debated and wondered at. It became the kind of story that changes the shape of how people think. And quietly, without ceremony, in 100 languages on 100 worlds, the meaning of one word shifted. Human. It had meant many things before. Young, reckless, unpredictable, strange. Now when beings who had watched what happened at Vale Prime used the word, it carried something else underneath all those other meanings. Or something that had no perfect translation in most languages. The closest any species came was a Suvari phrase that had been used for centuries to describe the feeling of seeing a light in the dark when you no longer expected one. They will not leave you. That was what the word meant now. And somewhere in the archive building in Thesavar, Thesavakal Morn sat in his garden in the warmth of a sun that had decided to keep burning, and he listened to his plants grow.